bills related to the insurance crisis got a hearing at the state capitol today.
And as Sabrina Wilson reports, some would benefit homeowners who upgrade their roofs, but another face so much pushback, the author voluntarily deferred a vote.
The insurance crisis is a big part of the agenda for the legislative session underway at the state capitol, and two bills that would force insurers to provide property owners discounts if they harden their roofs made it out of the House Insurance Committee and will be considered now by the full House of Representatives. One of the bills is by Representative Matthew Willard of New Orleans.
It would require insurance companies to provide an actuarially justified discount for homeowners who rebuild their roof with the fortified home designation or retrofit it to accommodate that as well.
And the other is by Representative Raymond Garofalo of St. Bernard Parish.
We want to make sure that consumers are aware of how much of a discount they'll receive if they choose to spend the money to fortify their roof, and thereby give them an incentive to fortify their roof.
But another bill by Representative Garofalo dealing with the insurance appraisal process faced a lot of pushback.
It sets the procedure for selection of an umpire, which would be by the commissioner if there's no lawsuit filed, and by the judge if there is a lawsuit filed. And it talks about if the appraisers don't agree on an umpire, how that umpire would then be selected. And it requires the department to maintain a list of umpires that are available.
It gives tremendous amount of additional power to the Commissioner of Insurance, and frankly, it can deprive a policyholder from their day in court if they've been wronged by their insurance company.
The legislation would make the decision of appraisers and umpire binding.
This is, in my mind, making all of this binding arbitration and taking the courts out of it, and maybe reducing an avenue that a claimant may have.
And lawyers like Luke Williamson, who does insurance litigation, agree.
Well, it's not necessary. At the end of the day, this appraisal system already exists. What this law actually does is make the effect of the appraisal system binding. Currently, other issues can still be litigated with the court after an appraisal is in process.
Given the concerns by some legislators and the public, Garofalo deferred the bill.
What do you think would be the consequences for homeowners if this legislation passes in its current form?
Then you could see policyholders losing their right to redress the issues with their insurance company in court.
Garofalo says it's not his intent to hurt Louisiana policyholders, and he agrees the legislation needs more work. So after hours of discussion today, it was deferred until at least next week. Meanwhile, lawmakers plan to approve millions of dollars for the Louisiana Fortify Homes program to provide homeowners with grants to make their roofs hardier.